Some relationships don't really end with a big explosion. They just fade out quietly. In this explainer, we're going to look at what happens when a divorce isn't just an ending, but maybe a really difficult and even necessary wake-up call. And that quote right there, it just gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? The idea that the problem isn't that the love is gone. No, it's something deeper. It's old pains, old wounds that were never dealt with, just quietly poisoning the well from the inside. So how do we even begin to see this stuff? Well, what we're talking about today comes from insights from AI models that have sifted through thousands of personal stories about breakups. And what they found by spotting these patterns is this destructive cycle that so often bubbles just beneath the surface, sometimes for years. We're going to follow one relationship as a kind of case study to see exactly how this whole thing unfolds. Okay, so it all kicks off with what you could call an unseen emotional block. This is the starting point. It's the source of that distance, that first almost invisible crack in the foundation that just gets wider and wider over time. At the very core of this is something called protective withdrawal. Now, this is not someone making a conscious choice to be cold or to push you away. It's more like an involuntary survival mode. When someone's faced with a ton of stress or old trauma, their nervous system literally just hits the emergency brake. It shuts down emotionally because deep down, it thinks engaging is dangerous. It's meant to be a shield, not a weapon. And right here, this is the critical misunderstanding. For the person who's withdrawing, it feels like self-protection. It's a shield they need to survive. But for their partner, on the receiving end, it feels like rejection. It feels personal. It feels like they're being deliberately pushed away. And this is where the real damage really begins to set in. So this withdrawal, it leads right into the next phase, what we're calling the high cost of silence. Because it turns out, the biggest threat to a relationship isn't necessarily the fighting, it's the total absence of any real emotional connection. And this just hammers that point home. The data from these AI analyses is totally clear. That empty space created by emotional silence is way more destructive than conflict. I mean, at least with arguments, you're still engaged in something. But silence, that's the sound of disconnection. And this silence, it sets off a chain reaction that's almost totally predictable. First, any real emotionally present communication just stops. Then, into that vacuum, assumptions come rushing in. You start making up stories about what your partner's thinking or feeling, and let's be honest, you're probably wrong. And finally, all that guesswork and all that silence creates this huge chasm where closeness and intimacy used to be. So where does this path of disconnection end up? Well, all too often, it leads to a place of broken trust and what most of us would call betrayal. But the story of how a couple gets there is usually a lot more complicated than it looks on the surface. What the AI pattern analysis shows again and again is this. A relationship's foundation starts to crumble when one person's pain is consistently missed or ignored or just plain unseen. And it doesn't even matter if it's unintentional, if it's just a result of that protective withdrawal we talked about. The emotional scars are still real. That feeling of being invisible to the one person who's supposed to see you better than anyone else, it's just devastating. And here is the absolute crucial point. We tend to think that an affair is what causes a marriage to break down, but what the AI analysis suggests is that it's usually just a symptom of a marriage that has already broken down emotionally. The betrayal is often this desperate, misguided attempt to feel seen, to feel connected, to fill a void that's been there for a very, very long time. But, the end of the marriage doesn't have to be the end of understanding. Actually, sometimes it's only after it's over that a real conversation can finally happen, and that can pave the way for some genuine healing. In the case we've been following, the couple actually started having truly honest talks after their divorce was final. With all the pressure of trying to save the marriage gone, they could finally just admit to the pain on both sides. This didn't lead to them getting back together, but it led to something else just as valuable. A mutual understanding, and the insight they both needed to make sure they didn't repeat the same painful patterns ever again. And that's really the heart of it, isn't it? You can't go back and change what happened, but trying to understand why it happened, your part, their part, the whole dynamic you created together, that is the only way you can build a healthier emotional future for yourself. Which brings us to our final and maybe most important section. How do we actually apply these lessons? What are the practical steps we can take toward healing? So I want to ask you, just for a second, As we've walked through all of this, do you see any echoes of these patterns in your own life? Maybe in a relationship you're in right now? Or maybe one from your past? If the answer is yes, even a little bit, it's so important that we reframe how we think about getting help. Therapy is not an admission of weakness. It's not a sign of failure. It is practical skill building. Think about it. Most of us were never taught how to handle these really complex emotional things, like trauma responses or deep-seated protective withdrawal. Therapy is where you go to learn those skills. And the data really backs this up. Those same AI models show, time and time again, that the outcomes are so much better when people get professional help early on, before years of silence and misunderstanding have caused damage that might be impossible to undo. In the end, a divorce doesn't have to be this big red stamp of failure. Sometimes it's the painful event that finally wakes you up, gives you awareness of your old wounds, your unhealthy patterns, and the desperate need for a new way of being, both with yourself and with other people. And so we'll leave you with this question to think about. Look, not every relationship is meant to last forever, but every single one, whether it works out or it doesn't, holds some powerful lessons. The real challenge is just being brave enough to learn them, so we can all figure out how to love ourselves and each other a little better next time.